I appreciate you guys asking me to come in to speak to you. I have a presentation at the Manitoba Beekeeping Association I'm going to do on Saturday, and I'm not really good at public speaking, so I'm going to use this engagement as a bit of a practice for it. So what I want to do is, if you guys have any questions as we go through, just holler out. What I do up here is what it is, but the interesting conversation is with the feedback from the audience. So you guys be sure to ask questions as we go through. I tend to talk a little bit fast sometimes, so it can kind of slow me down if you need. And just make sure, everything I say here, make sure you understand that this is one man's opinion, and the best thing you can do is ask a whole bunch of different beekeepers about this kind of stuff, and then put all the stuff together into a plan. So this is the way I understand, this is the way I see the beekeeping world. So I'm just going to pass a little bit of it on to you. So I just put together just a little casual slide here, and I'm going to be talking about early and late season management, just through the bees. So specifically on disease control and feeding. So where do you start with the planning for bees? I like this quote. I'm not exactly, I've searched to see where this quote's come from. If anybody knows who said this quote, tell me. But 5 minutes into battle, my plans go out the window. That said, I never go into battle without a plan. So that describes my beekeeping year exactly. Carrie can vouch for that too. We're very well planned, but as soon as we get into the bees, into the work, problems happen and we have to adjust. And so we're kind of adjusting on the go, but we always have a plan in mind, and we're always trying to execute that plan but adjusting at the same time. So where do we start? We start right now in the planning stage. That's what we're doing right now. The first thing I do, and the first thing all of you guys should be doing, is on their first round should be your initial assessments. And this is just, this is last spring. We put our bees out of the shed. I keep my bees inside in a wintering shed. And it was a particularly mild spring, so we didn't have a lot of frost. I usually have a bunch of yards. I set my bees out into my spring yards, but I couldn't get to the yards because it's too muddy. So I found this gravel pit, and I placed all 1,500 hives down into this gravel pit. And it wasn't the best thing I can do, but we went around and we didn't find too much drifting issue because of it. But we have all our bees out, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to be making our assessment rounds. And we're going to emergency feed. We have to do that right away. We have to let the bees fly before we can get into the bees. We like to get them a little bit of flight. We want to assess their colony strength, and we're going to call out the dead in the week. And at the same time, we're going to disease sample. So this is all during my first round. So the first thing we're going to do is emergency feed. And what we're basically doing is there's some pretty big hives, and I keep my hives in single boxes. So some of them are getting a little light by the time we get them out of winter. So what I'm going to do is I'm going through and we're going to heft the hives. Carrie and I go through and we just kind of pick up the hives. We feel for the light hives, right? So you're looking for the ones that are hungry. And I can't seem to get syrup into my hives. They don't seem to want to consume syrup right out of the shed. So what we do is we go through and we drop honey frames in, okay? So we go through and we have, if it's light, we drop honey frames in that we gathered from last fall or whatever. And anything that's too
along the outside or right in the middle, or?
Yeah, always around the outside of the nest, where I'm a big believer in when you have that cluster, that you want to maintain the integrity of that cluster. So you want to put the honey on the outside of the cluster, because if you drop it right in the center, you're breaking that cluster up and you're screwing around with their whole cluster dynamics.
Potentially brood in there as well.
Yeah, you don't want to break that up. So what I like to do is I like to take the 2 empty frames from the outside and then drop honey on the outside of the cluster. That's what I do. And I do that in my first round.
And how do you store those frames?
Those frames, in the fall, we'll go through and we'll call it dead in a week. So there'll be brood comb with honey in there. So we'll segregate out all the honey frames, and we'll just store it in the shed, and we'll take those.
Is it capped, or how do you make sure it doesn't crystallize? Or
Some will be granulated, yeah.
Okay.
So we don't worry about that. the size of the hive, usually these big guys, they can handle granulated comb quite easily. They'll have water coming in too.
That's the thing with spring is there's water everywhere, so they've got access to water
Helps them
right away.
liquefy the granulated
Especially
combs.
with where we keep our
Yeah.
bees, it seems to be everywhere.
So that's the first thing we do is we go through and we make sure that they have feed in them. And as we're assessing these hives, for weight, we're also assessing for strength. And I'm gonna get into this a little more detail at the Manitoba Beekeeping Convention. Is anybody here going to that? Yeah, so I'll see you guys here and I'll talk a little bit more on this. This is very important. You have to know the condition of your stock, right? You gotta know what you have. And you wanna be able to measure your growth of your colony throughout the spring to be able to assess that queen. That's really important. I won't get into it right now, but what I do is I'll count the frames of bees to assess your stock. And by counting the frames of bees, you have to make sure you do it from underneath the hive all the time. Open up the top, the bees will go out over the top of the frames, and you don't actually know what you have because they'll spread out. But if you look underneath, here I'm counting 4 frames here, 1, 2, 3, 4. They're going to hold a definite cluster from underneath, and they'll never lie to you if you look at them from underneath. So I'm always assessing from underneath. And what I'm doing is I'm going to mark my strong ones. They're 7 to 9 framers. My medium ones, these ones are, I'd call them mediums, they're about 4s or so. And then anything under 3s, I call my weak. And then I'll take those hives, the weak ones, I'll take them off to a nursery yard. And it's basically, we just tip back and we just count the frames of bees. So here's Carrie, she's tipping the hives back. So I'd probably count 8 on that one. And then you get into a little bit smaller hive. So this one, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You're going to count the seams, right? So I'd count that one as a medium type hive. And it's really important that you guys assess your colony so you know what you have there. And this one I'd call 10 frames. So if you know what you have, you can, off the initial assessment, then you assess later on in the year, and that's how you assess your queen quality. But I'll get into that in Winnipeg. So then I'm also going through and we're calling out the deads and the weak. Anything that's just little patches of bees, get rid of them. Don't even, just shake them out. So we bring all the equipment back to the honey house, and this is really important. When you're checking through your dead out equipment, you're looking for American foulbrood. It's really important that you guys have surveillance for American foulbrood. I'm going to just touch on it a little bit later on in here, but all the deads, every frame that we put through, we scrape them clean, and we're continually assessing for American foulbrood. If we find anything that has any scales on it or whatever, they go into the burning pit automatically. So what we're doing here is we're scraping the boxes clean, and then what I want to do is separate out the empty frames and then the full frames of honey and the pollen. And by doing that, I can later take these frames to make up splits, right? You put your honeys and your pollens and your empties, and you can make up really uniform boxes. And disease sampling. Through that first round, we're monitoring for disease, and it's all random assessments. We're looking for varroa mite, that's the big one. And with the varroa mite, you have viral infections, so they're kind of linked there together. I get my bees analyzed for viral infections. We'll talk about that in just a bit. No Zima and bacterial infection. The American foulbrood or European foulbrood, the first round you're not really looking for that because you need colony growth to be able to. For American foulbrood to express itself, the brood has to be actually growing, right? So we survey those later on in the spring. When you're checking for, how many of you guys check for mites? How do you guys do it? Do you guys use an alcohol wash?
Yeah.
Primarily? Yeah, that's a really efficient way of checking for mites in your bees. So what you're supposed to do is open up your nest and find a brood frame because you want to measure the mites on the young bees, right? The mites will be within that brood nest because they're migrating in and out of the brood cells. So they're hitching a ride on the young bees all the time. So that's where you want to catch the mites. That's where you sample your bees from. And we use alcohol to do it, because alcohol, rubbing alcohol, it dislodges the mites from the bees very effectively. And we use these little shakers. What I do, because we have a lot of bees to go through, so we kind of push the limits a little bit. Instead of pulling the brood frame up, what I'm doing, and what Carrie usually is the one doing, we go around and we pick random hives through the apiary. And then we tip these hives back, and we take a sample of the bees as close to that brood frame as we possibly can. So I'm assuming the brood is going to be within the center of this nest, and that's where I'm going to take my sample from. So we go through with this little bee vac thing, and we just randomly take samples as close to that brood nest as we can. And by doing that, we're getting a good proportion of young bees in our sample. So then we take it into this little shaker thing, and we shake the bees, and it dislodges the mites. It follows through the screen, and then you count your mites in the bottom of the canister. So there should be, I don't think there's any mites in this count. But then you take your mites and you count it over the number of bees inside your sample, and that'll give you your thresholds. So these thresholds are really important. We follow them very strictly. In the spring, you want thresholds of less than 1%. If you have mite population in your spring bees of over 1%, you have to take it very seriously, and I highly recommend you to use a chemical treatment, because the virus on those bees will overcome your bees as they go into summer. So you need to keep your bees under 1% in the spring. If you have mite counts under 1%, we'll go through with other methods, like alternative methods. You have formic acid and oxalic acid and such. But if you have, and in the fall too, at 2.5%, that's your threshold. If you're 2.5% and over, you make sure you control those mites, and you do it with that chemical means. You make sure you control them. So that's your threshold. So pay attention to those numbers. Last fall, I think we were running under 1% for our mite counts. So we were able to keep our bees off a chemical treatment last fall, and then we treated with an oxalic acid vapor treatment, just because we didn't have the population inside our hives, and it allowed us to target the mites later on in the fall. So the chemical treatment that we can use is Apivar. Is very effective. I was talking to Riel about it. There's fear about Apivar resistance coming through right now. And I was talking to Riel in December about it, and he said the bioassays of Amitraz is still showing over 85% effectiveness. So Apivar is still an option for us. Down in the States, down in California, they're telling me they're having huge loss problems down there, because I think the resistance is creeping into their hives a little bit quicker than us. We're usually 10 years behind California. The other alternative treatments is with acids. Do you guys use oxalic acid? That's a very effective means with dribble or vapor. I use a vapor treatment. You can use formic acid. I kind of shy away from formic acid because it's kind of hard on your bees, especially here when the conditions are so variable. You need consistent conditions for formic to really work properly. And cultural mite trapping through drone comb, and we haven't done any of that yet. But what I do with the oxalic acid, it's in the fall. You want to target your hives when the hive is broodless. And this is a ProVap 110, and carries loaded 2.5 grams or so of oxalic acid into this ProVap. It sublimates the oxalic acid, so there's like a fine dust going throughout the entire cluster. And what the oxalic acid does, and they're not quite exactly sure how it works, but all this oxalic acid dust will coat the inside of the hive, and whether it affects the pads on the mites so they can't grab onto the bees, or if it deteriorates their exoskeleton when they dehydrate, they're not sure. But that is the ProVap 110. This is a VM. We used this 2 years ago. It's really satisfying because it's like you have this big cannon and you're just blasting the mites with this thing. So it's really fun to use. Carrie probably got tired of it after a little while.
Very tired.
But it is very effective. This killed the mites dead. I went from 5% mite infestation 2 falls ago. I was in a very serious problem. So my neighbor rented me this VM, and we blasted him with this oxalic acid vapor, and it killed all the mites. But there's no brood present in the hive, so that's very important, is it doesn't target the mites underneath the capping, so it has to be brood free. We left a yard as a control yard, untreated, so they went into winter with 5% loss, or went into winter with 5% infestation. And my main yard that was treated, we had 10% loss or so. That control yard was 75% loss. So it's a good thing that we went through the oxalic. It's a very effective tool. So if you can integrate it into your whole mite management plan, I would highly suggest you do that.
You can only do that in fall then, because he said it has to be no brood.
It has to be broodless. Medhat from Alberta, he's doing some testing with doing multiple treatments, like 5 days apart, and he's finding that the vapor is a lot easier on the bees than the dribble is. The dribble, you put oxalic acid in syrup, you dribble it on the bees, but the bees will ingest the syrup, so it's really hard in the bees' stomachs and the guts. But with the vapor, they don't seem to find that the oxalic is hard on the bees, so he can do multiple treatments with that. So he's going 5, I think he said 5-day treatments, or is it 7 days between treatments, 3 times in a row, and he just keep knocking those mites down, right? And he's seeing efficacy that way, but we haven't tested that yet.
Ian, before you move on there, that oxalic acid, that's considered an organic acid, right?
Organic acid.
It's something that happens naturally when you have rhubarb, that kind of thing. It's natural in there. So when you're eating rhubarb, you're actually eating it. So the people, like, I know there's a few of you in here that are trying to keep things as natural as possible. If you're looking to not have your bees die because of a high mite count, it might be best to go with something like an oxalic acid if you're trying to stay completely away from something like the apibar strips, which are highly effective, but some people are averse to the hard chemicals. So.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, very important to monitor your mites at the same time as you're doing it. If you're working with acids and these alternative treatments, they're not 100%. Like, you put a strip in there, you're going to kill mites. It's almost guaranteed, unless there's resistance come. With these organic acids, there's a little more leeway. So, are you getting them all or you're not? With the chemical strips, you have an extended period of treatment time, which is very effective, and the acids are more of a, you just keep knocking them down, right?
And as long as you're sublimate through all your frames, you're better off, but we know what Manitoba weather's like, and sometimes it doesn't happen.
Yeah, and we treated pretty late this last fall, and it was pretty cool. So
Yeah,
whether or not that fog got in the cluster,
But then we had brood up until, I still had brood last week in October, no problem.
Yeah, so we're missing mites there for
So
sure.
we're missing mites there.
Yeah. So with the mites come the virus. This is why we have such low thresholds with the mites. Before, we could run higher thresholds in our mites, with our mites in our hives. But now with all these viruses, I was at the BC Honey Producers Association convention, and Carlos Castillo, he's the main guy who runs the lab at the National Bee Diagnostic Center in Alberta. And he was doing a presentation on viruses, and he had like 3 slides of virus, and most of them I didn't even know. It's like, holy man, like, holy smokes, this is a lot. This is a big problem. This is a analysis that the Honeybee Health Survey they went through last year, I participated in, and they tested my stock for diseases. Here's a list of all the viral infections that they're testing for. There's how many, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 or so there. And this particular yard they tested out of, I had no mite count in this yard, and I'm still pulling out these viruses. So I had black cell queen virus, deformed wing virus, Lake Snarry virus, I don't even know what that one is, but apparently everybody has it now, and sackbrood virus. So I had 4 viral infections there. They just detected these viruses. They didn't give me any quantitative levels. Last spring I sent away a live bee sample within my apiary just to see what kind of viral infection I had, and they gave me quantitative counts. And the main concern is deformed wing virus. This is one that's killing everybody's hives, is the deformed wing virus. Out of my sample that we sent away, and I had no mites in my apiary at that time, I had like deformed wing copies per bee gene of 75,000. And there's a neighbor here that's having trouble with, the commercial guy having trouble with mites in his hives. And he sent away a live sample to the bee diagnostic center just to see what kind of viral infection he had going on. And he had like mite counts over 5%, some upper 8%, and he's talking 205 million deformed wing copies per bee gene. So there's a direct relationship between mites and virus. And this is the one that's killing our hives. This is the main one. So Zima, does anybody know much about Zima? Zima is kind of that phantom disease right now. We used to, Zima, when I started beekeeping, seriously I started beekeeping about 17 or 18 years ago. Zima apis was the species that was killing our hives. And we had an antibiotic that we could use to combat this disease. It seemed to help very well. But we had another species come in from Europe called Zima cinnarii, and it's taken over apis. We had a complete species shift of Zima in our hives right now. And the cinnarii, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, cinnaria, but it doesn't get controlled by fumagillin like apis did. So whether the species shift happened because the fumagillin was controlling the apis but not the cinnarii, or if it's just simply out competing the apis, I'm not sure. But this one is causing us more trouble than we'd like to admit. We seem to have higher counts of Zima cerana than apis. Apis we'd see outright losses about 2 million spore counts. Cerana, I'm getting like 25, 50 million counts in my bees, and they don't seem to be dying, outright dying like apis used to kill them. But I take cerana very seriously. Here's a slide of one of I have a microscope in my honey house, and this isn't focused very well, but these are spores, and this is a heavily infected gut. This is a clean gut. This is all the microflora. And I killed that bee, I put it underneath the microscope, and this whole slide was moving with life. That's a microflora inside the bee's gut. And they're helping the bee digest these are pollen grains. So they're helping the bee digest the pollen in their gut to extract all the good nutrients from everything they're ingesting. In this gut, there's no room for microflora, and these guys are extracting all the nutrition from the bees. It's a serious problem. If one thing, the Zima has been linked to decreasing the lifespan of the bees by 1/3. So you have your bee live for 6 or 7 or 8 weeks. It's like you're just chopping off a week and a half or 2 weeks off at the end of the lifespan of that bee. So you're severely affecting the whole, the work structure within that hive as they the division of work within the hive. They graduate from nurse bees into processing bees into foraging bees. Now, if those forager bees are dying, like they're dying in 1 week instead of 3 weeks, that means the whole division of labor through the entire hive, the nurse bees and the processing bees and graduate to the forager bees, they all have to quicken up that process. So the whole division of work gets thrown on its head. And when the Zima is out competing, it's extracting all the nutrients from the bees. Those nurse bees, when they're feeding the developing brood, the nurse bees use the nutrition to create a royal jelly, right? There's these glands in their head right behind their eyes, and they develop this brood feed, and they're feeding the brood through these glands. They need nutrition to do that. When the bees are malnourished, they're not feeding a high enough protein feed to the developing brood. And the studies are showing us that when that brood is not being fed a rich enough diet, a proper diet, those bees are in the developmental stage become malnourished, and later on in their life, like 4 or 6 weeks ahead, when they're actually doing work, they're bringing in resources, they're not thrifty, they're not working as hard. They find that those bees are not lazy, but just not as well performing as they should be. So it's a huge cyclical problem. You have bees that are malnourished in their developmental stage, and they graduate into their forager bee as unthrifty bees that their lifespan's cut in half because the nosema is just throwing the whole hive into a cycle. And we don't necessarily see this. It's not a direct translation. We just see a poor beehive, right? We just see a hive that's just not doing anything. We see this in our apiary too. What's going on here? So I think nosema is one of the bigger concerns that nobody pays attention to. I'm a cattle producer, and I believe in an animal with a healthy gut is a healthy animal. So there's a few ways we can determine the infestation within our hives. There's composite sampling, and that's taking like a sample of 10 bees within your apiary and putting it all together in one, and then taking one sample. And I don't do this. I don't have a hemocytometer. I think that's how you pronounce it. But they'll do, you gather bees from the entrance of your bees, from your hives, because you want the bees from the outside of the cluster. Okay, you want the older bees. So you test from the hive lids or from the hive entrances. And you crush the bees up, and you put it in a solution, and you throw it under this hemocytometer. You count the spores, and then you do a mathematical equation to give you your spore counts. I went into winter last year with spore counts under 1 million, so I was in pretty good shape. I've had spore counts up to 75 million, which is pretty high. So there's a flaw in this whole method of sampling is if you have a really sick bee within your sample, it will give you a false reading of what's actually in there. So Randy Oliver, do you guys read anything that he puts out there? Randy Oliver, scientificbeekeeping.com. Go to that site because he's just got a wealth of information. And he's come out with like a sequential sampling, more of a, you're identifying the sick bees, the positive bees. So what you do is you go through, you identify 10 hives, and you take 10 bees from each one of those hives. And then you take each bee and you look at them from underneath the microscope. So you take your bees and you crush them. And from every one of those bees, you look underneath the microscope. And all you're looking for is nosema. That's all you're looking for. If you see nosema, then if you see something like this, then you mark that as a positive. If you're looking at this, then you're not marking that as a negative. Okay, so you're just looking for nosema. And what you do is out of those 10 bees, if you have like one positive, one infected bee out of 10, the other 9 have no nosema, then that hive's in good shape. But if you're finding like 4 or over 4 bees in that hive, then you're getting into a really heavily infested colony. So then you take those 10 hives and you count all the ones in the danger zone. So through last winter, I was testing my bees, and I had like 6 hives out of the 10 in the danger zone. I had like heavy infestation of nosema. So then I compared it back to what I had going on in my composite sampling, and I'm looking at 25 million spore counts. So I had a major nosema problem in my hives last year, and I think we've seen a little bit of that health concern in the spring. So you're going to ask me what we're going to do about it, and we can't do a damn thing about it. So we just have to look at our bees and and just watch them die. Nice weather, nice sunny flight weather, that helps keep the bees moving forward. But if you have a cold, wet spring and they're heavily infested with nosema, then you're likely going to see unthrifty bees later on. So that's what I have to say about nosema. So for foul broods, the foul broods I take extremely seriously. I'll just touch upon European foul brood first. European foul brood, not a lot of beekeepers know what it looks like. And it's not as serious as American foul brood. European foul brood, it infects the larvae at the beginning stages of its life. and they die before the cells get capped over. And the bees identify the dead larvae, and they'll come and they'll pull the larvae out, and they're still intact, and they can kick them out the front. It's a stress-related disease, so beekeepers miss this one a lot. And me too, I miss it lots. The hive will get sick, and before you get back to it next time, the sun will come back out and the bees will clean out all the cells, and you open up your nest and you won't see any symptom of European foulbrood except for a spotty brood pattern. A lot of guys will blame that spotty brood pattern on the queen, but it's actually European foulbrood because the nest was sick and the bees actually cleaned out that nest, and then you're just seeing the hive cleaned out after that. In a cold, wet, stressful spring, you're seeing a European foulbrood. One thing you can do for them is give them a bacterial, antibacterial, like oxytetracycline. That's very effective. It works very well against European foulbrood. But American foulbrood, they get infected the same way. They get infected in the early stages of their larval life, but they die after the cell gets capped over. Okay, the bees will come in and they'll identify that dead larvae underneath the cell, so they'll try uncapping that cell, and they go in to extract the dead larvae, but the American foulbrood dissolves the membranes and such, so it's like they're trying to hold the sticky tar. So they can't effectively clean that cell. They get it all over their mandibles and their bodies, and before you know it, the colony is collapsing from death because it's just a compounding problem. They can't get rid of that bacterial infection. And the problem with American foulbrood is when that hive starts to die, it's just the bees' way. All the hives 2 miles around will come in and they'll extract all the resources from that colony, right? And while they're doing that, they're bringing back the American foulbrood back to the colony. So you're, by not being able to identify this disease and not taking care of it, and guys, either they don't identify it or it dies and they haven't found the problem, you're exposing everything within the 2 mile radius to American foulbrood. Is a huge problem. If you do see this, contact your provincial apiarist to help you out, because he'll come and help you identify and go through the rest of the apiary to make sure the rest is okay. And the only thing you can do with American foulbrood is burning the frames. There's nothing else you can do. When I first got into beekeeping, let's say about 17 years ago, I bought some hives from a guy from Winnipeg, and he had American foulbrood, and he wasn't supposed to sell beehives, but he did anyways, and I was naive and I didn't know any better. So I brought these beehives into my apiary and they died over winter, so then I took the equipment and I made a bunch of splits out of this equipment. And then the bee inspector come in just as on their regular rounds, and he identified the American foulbrood, and I didn't know what it looked like. So he showed me this and I said, oh shoot, and he said, you better get this under control. And it was in its active growth, it was starting to spread. I went through, I was supposed to go to the lake that week, and I was too stressed out, so I went and spent the next 4 days going through my whole apiary, just scouring for American foulbrood, and I found 15 hives that are infected and they had an active infection going on. So I overreacted, and I just took those hives at night and I went and torched them. And I haven't seen disease since then. I know guys that had American foulbrood, and what they'd do is they'd take the bees and they'd shake the bees off into a box of foundation and feed them medicated syrup. And they'd burn the equipment, but they'd salvage the bees, and they're able to break the cycle of American foulbrood by taking them off the contaminated equipment and feeding them medicated syrup. It breaks the cycle of the disease, and they're able to break that cycle and salvage some bees. But I think I would have just burnt them anyways. So if you have American foulbrood, or if you know somebody who might, make sure you talk to Rael about it, because it's a very serious concern.
And you burn the whole boxes, not just the frames?
I burnt everything. Didn't want anything to do with it because it's very, it can spread very easily, very infectious. So I burnt everything. I know they're talking about your frames are your main source of contamination, so those have to go. Guys are salvaging boxes too and not transferring the disease, but there will be disease. There will be spores on that equipment. So the spore will live for a long time, and whether that expresses.
And Rao just told me to torch the inside of the boxes, burn the frames and torch.
He's done a study on that, and they find that the frame mostly transfers with the comb, but you're still gonna have, you know, I'd be very leery about it.
I haven't seen it since, that was.
It's very frustrating when you
2
buy
years
infected
ago.
bees like that, because I know the feeling. So-
Problem with wood is the grains, even if you torch the outside of, like the inside of your boxes, like the grain's so deep, and it's such a good insulator, you're not guaranteed you're going to get them all.
Yeah. One thing that I do in the spring, if you have neighbors that you think might have American foul brood, during their Robbie seasons, when there's probably going to be more of a chance of your bees visiting other hives, because you know the hives in the area, treat with oxytetracycline just to, if
In the spring.
in the spring. Not when you're bringing honey in them. Like,
Yeah.
it's got to just be the brood box itself, because you don't want to contaminate your honey. But during Robbie seasons, when you know the bees might be going out into dying hives, if they're bringing it in, then this will help prevent that infection from starting.
Yeah, I haven't done it, well, I guess I did it 2 years ago, Linda, but I didn't do it last year, and I didn't see any, so.
So, aren't they phasing that out though,
Yeah, I was gonna ask what your opinion is
Antibiotics?
about that, cause they're, you know, because everybody's just treating as a matter of course, right, with these antibiotics.
Most guys I know aren't. Most guys, like myself, I don't use antibiotic unless I have to. We have, all the guys I know anyways, the commercial guys, have a heavy surveillance program. They're looking and they're looking, and if they find that they're getting an outbreak, I only know one guy that's had an outbreak in the last 10 years, and then they'll use the antibiotic. They'll let the neighbors know
Okay.
just to try to contain it, right?
with American foul brood? But I thought you couldn't treat it. Don't you have to burn them?
You have to burn it, yeah.
Right, okay.
But
But
then
if
they'll use
you
that as
have your
prevention.
apron going on,
Oh, okay,
And
but
if-
the other
if you're
kinds.
thinking as your neighbor might have
Okay,
American foul brood
yeah.
going on, during that Robbie season where you think that the bees might be visiting his equipment, because
Yeah.
maybe you guys are too close or whatever, that's one way you can help prevent the infection from establishing in your apron.
You can still use that, you just need to get it from the vet, can't you?
Yeah, they're not allowing like Bee Made to sell it anymore. You have to
Yeah.
get a prescription for it,
Yeah.
which is no big deal. You just have to get a
Get the vet to come
get the
look
vet
at
to
your
come
bees,
out and
yeah.
visit you.
Yeah.
But
Good luck
they'll
with that.
they'll give you a ticket and you'll be able to buy the stuff. There's the overuse, you're probably talking the overuse of oxytetracycline and resistance forming because of it. And there is that down, I won't say any more about that, but there's another product on the market called Tylen, and it works very effectively against American foul brood too.
What's it called again?
Tylen. That you do need a prescription for sure, but Bee Made sells that also.
So when you said that some beekeepers will just take the bees out, put it in another box without comb, what kind of medicated feed are they using?
With
The
this.
vat? Okay.
Yeah, within the syrup, so then they're
Yeah.
ingesting it, and they're building new wax, and then with with antibiotic within their system, they don't allow the vegetative growth of the American foul brood. Yeah. So it gets you an option, I guess, but it's a nasty one, so we have to pay really close attention to it. So supplemental feeding, do you guys feed your bees any protein?
Try
I know
to
Josh does.
make it available to them anyway.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in supplemental feeding. We have a changing landscape out there right now, and not to anybody's fault, but the diversity is just kind of disappearing. And whichever way you look at it, bees need pollen. We can't raise bees on supplement. We can't get the bees to go through more than one or two cycles. We can't get the bees to go through 2 cycles without pollen in their diet. There's complex fats and nutrients that they get from the pollen itself that the bees need. Purina has come out with the bee feed and they claim they've matched pollen, but I am very skeptical about that. I don't think they're pretty quiet about it yet. So one of the reasons of malnutrition is monoculture, and we're seeing more and more of this. Farmers are, we farm 3,000 acres of land, so this is our field, and we've adopted GM technology and Roundup, and it's not the GM or the Roundup that's killing the bees, but it's the clean fields. The farmers are doing such a good job manicuring their property that there's no diversity left. And bees need diversity to be able to thrive, right? Ditches are being sprayed and mowed. Bees need pollen, so wherever you are, you have to make sure your bees are touching a little bit of pollen here and there and everywhere. If there's nothing, if it's like a desert, then they're gonna die, no matter what you do. You have to have them on pollen. But we can help them out a little bit. If we have pollen coming in, but not the amount that we need, we can supplement them to help them with their nutrition. So forget about all this down here, but this is a growth chart in a beehive in the spring. I put them out, and this is your brood line, okay, and this is your population line. So you want your bees to be moving forwards at all times. You want them to be progressing like this. And through the spring we'll have pollen dearths, right? So we have pollen and then dearth, pollen and dearth. And what the bees will do is they'll bring in a bunch of pollen, but they'll hold reserves for those dearths, so it kind of evens out all those dips. When you have a frame in the spring, you have all these bees going out and bringing in a wealth of pollen. It excites that queen, and she starts laying frames of brood. And you don't have a lot of pollen in there, but you have enough in there. Do you see a problem with this frame? It's a beautiful frame of brood.
But no pollen.
But there's no pollen. They've activated and they're just going to town. And they're living hand to mouth right now. And there's not enough pollen in the environment to be able to create a surplus, right? So we have to consider that. If we find a dearth, this brood line all of a sudden dips like this, right? Until they get nutrition back, and they'll bring it back up. And that little dip in this brood line, you'll see it up here in your bee population. So what we want to do is we want to fill in those little dips like this. We want to make sure they're continually growing all through the season. This was in 2015. This was May 17th, right before we split our hives. And a week and a half before this, there's dandelion pollen coming in and fruit pollen, wherever it's coming in, and they have reserves inside. We're putting 2 pounds of patty on top of these hives, and I'm thinking to myself, are we wasting our time and wasting our money because we have this beautiful spring, and we have all this pollen reserve in our hives at that time, but we're still putting patties out. So then a week comes by, and then all of a sudden we see snow in the forecast like this, and I can't get through my apiary in less than 3 days, okay? So I see this weather coming along, and I can't get through to put patties on in less than 3 days. That's why I have the patties on all the time. So this weather come through, they're brooding up. They have like 6, 7 frames of brood inside. This weather hit. They not only consumed all the pollen reserves inside, but they ate those 2 pounds of patty within 3 days. Just pow! They just absolutely consumed it. We come back around 5 days after or so to continue the split. And we put more patty on that time, but there was no interruption at all with our brood nest because they had all the protein. We gave them protein to help fill in that extreme dearth that they went through. So the supplemental feeding is like an investment. Like I was saying with the Zima, when you have a dearth come through and you have your brood nest being developed, when they fall under protein stress, what they'll do, and if they don't have enough reserves inside that hive, they'll cannibalize that brood nest, right? They'll eat all the fresh larvae that's going on in there to the point where they can sustain that brood nest. And you don't want that to happen. You want all those, you want that brood nest to keep moving forward. When they're doing that, they're cutting back the food that they're giving to their larvae. And when they cut back the food when they feed the larvae, it's putting that larvae into a protein stress. And malnourished larvae is going to be an unthrifty bee further down in his lifetime. It's very important that we keep these hives out of a protein stress. So this is why we go through and we put paddy on our hives all through the spring, just to make sure that we're filling in all those dips. And because the environment is being changed on us, we don't have the diversity, we're making sure we have the main building blocks on these hives, the protein on these hives.
When do you first start doing that? March or April?
First, when we first put them out, that first, second round, we start putting the paddies on, just as a workload.
I'd just like to add, not many people know this or think about it, but small hive beetle has been found south of Morden, and I've been told they love pollen hives.
Yes, yeah, see, this whole management plan is without small hive beetle being into the equation. So we'll have to, my whole management plan of keeping a supply of supplement on the hives at all times in the spring. If we had small hive beetle here, then that would be just a haven for those guys.
And it's been found south of Morden.
Yeah, do you have any in your apiary that you see?
No, I don't have any in mind, but I'm also watching for it because I'm right along the border.
Yeah,
And
there'd
they're
be
kind of
flying over the
proximity
border
working,
from the
yeah.
commercials down there.
Yeah.
So this is very specific. If we ever do get small hive beetle, and I hope we don't, but this is one of my strategies anyways. So you know your bees are actually consuming the paddy. See their little mandibles going there. They're actually consuming it. They're going to use it, and they're going to digest it. They're not taking, there's some paddies you buy in the market that they take and they just throw it out the front door. And that's very frustrating. So make sure when you put paddies on the hive that they're actively eating it and not just throwing it out the front door. So make sure you pick your paddies. So Randy Oliver come to the Manitoba Beekeeping Association convention, how many years ago was that? 5 years ago or so? Or, yeah, about that. And he really reinforced the strategy to me. He's talking about a malnourished hive. And how do you know if your hive's malnourished? When you pull your brood frames, you want your larvae to be in a lush puddle of royal jelly, right? You want it wet. He says you want your larvae swimming. So when you pull your frame up, you want your frame shining in the sun. When they're under protein stress, the first thing the bees will do is they'll cut back in the bee feed, and that cell will be dry. You'll have a little larvae sitting there, excuse me, but there will be hardly any royal jelly, and they'll be in a state of malnourishment at that time. So you want to you want to feed them protein to be able to keep this brood feed really nice and lush.
Hey, Ian, on the topic of nourishment, nutrition, and paddies, being that not all paddies are created equal, is there one that you recommend? What kind do you use? Not that I'm asking for an infomercial here, but I just
We've used lots of paddy. I've thrown lots of paddy in the bush, and I won't talk about those ones. But we switched to our own kind of a home brew. We mix, it's a yeast, soy flour based paddy, and dried egg, the eggs for the fats. And it's a really well balanced paddy, lots of sugars, about 50% sugars in it. And that's what this one was, because Carrie made this.
They seem to be enjoying them.
Yeah, and they're adjusting it. They do very well on this. And with a soy flour and a yeast based, your
Brewer's yeast? Is that what you're doing?
brewer's yeast, yeah. Your amino acid profile is balanced for the bee. So you have a balanced profile, but you also want fats. Fats are very important in your paddy, so that's where I put the egg in to give them vitamins and fats.
So soy is for the high protein?
Soy, bees just love soy, so you put it in but it's not a balanced food for a bee. So you put brewer's yeast in there, which the bees don't like, but brewer's yeast is high in vitamin B and very high in proteins, a well-balanced diet for the bees. Then you put your egg in there for your fats and your vitamins, and then you add a little bit of oil, canola oil, just to bump your fats a bit, and then mix it with corn syrup. This corn syrup is hygroscopic, and it'll absorb moisture from that cluster, and it'll keep that patty soft. So you're looking at like 10 pounds of soy flour, 10 pounds of brewer's yeast, 5 pounds of egg, dried egg, you buy it through Bee Made, and then enough corn syrup just to make it hard to mix.
In my head, I brought it down to my level, which was 10, 10, 2.5, which, yeah.
Yeah,
10,
and then,
10, 2.5.
and then you can add pollen into there too, by pollen from Bee Made, just to attract the bees to the patty a little
Okay,
bit.
so we've tried some of the commercially available bee patties and we haven't been impressed with those, so we switched over to a soy-based, like a powder feed, and so that's worked somewhat better.
Are you mixing it with, is this straight soy meal?
Just, no, it's, what's the name of this? Bee Pro.
Well, Bee Pro is balanced, yeah.
Yeah,
they
it's
have that
supposed to be a
balance.
balanced kind of a supplement, so, but if the weather is foul, or if it's cold, or if it's rain, they're not getting out to the feeder, we're feeding it on a, I guess, kind of a rod feed system.
Oh, yeah.
And they're not getting out to it either, so, and it's a wonderful squirrel trap.
So then good luck with the 10% patties that Bee Made carries. They're made in Manitoba, they've done well for me, those other ones.
Okay.
I don't know who makes them, but.
I don't know who it is, but also with dry supplement that I found, Ultra Bee is a lot more expensive, but I find their ability to take it in a lot greater than than the other one.
You introduce that straight to the hive, or?
No,
on a feeder?
like even when I feed patties like Ian does, I give them free choice on that too.
Okay.
Just to try and get as much supplement
Influence.
in there as possible, depending where you are. Like Ian's got yards in the bush and I have yards in the bush, and with the trees there, it's a little better than when they're out in the open. Like closer to where Josh is, there's not a lot of trees compared to.
It's a bit of a desert in spring.
Yeah.
I've started feeding with, there's a new product come out of Kentucky. It's called Bee Pollinate. It's very expensive, but it mixes a lot easier than that's home brew that we come up with. It mixes like dough, so you almost need a mortar mixer because you're using a drill and your arms are getting tired. But this Bee Pollinate, it's a yeast-based feed supplement, and it mixes almost like water. So you mix it up and you pour it into your mold, and it sets up like a real soft mousse-like consistency, and the bees just love the stuff. It's really expensive. So then I know a guy down in California, and he's big into pollination, and he builds lots of bees, and he just happens to make bee supplement, NutriBee. I don't know if you've heard of it, but we bought a semi in this spring, so we're going to try his product out too. So we're always looking for different supplements.
So, go ahead. So when you talk about you get the pollen from Bee Made, I've asked them, they always say they don't have it, only for human consumption, but
Okay.
I've gotten some from Propolis, etc.
Oh, yeah.
The irradiate, or how do you say it?
Irradiated.
Irradiated. Does it
Yeah.
have to be irradiated?
Yes, it's
Yes.
got to be.
And so
irradiated.
Bee Made has irradiated?
I've always bought from them, but it's a special order.
Oh, okay.
I would buy in a couple thousand pounds of it, and they'd likely, they don't like keeping a lot of it on hand.
Okay.
So, but another place if you're looking for it
Yeah.
is Nichols in McGregor.
Oh, okay.
He traps and he sells, and he makes those patties. I think that's what.
That's or yeah.
Mark Nickel, and he makes the patties, and you will have to book right away if you want some, because he uses a lot of that for his own product.
Okay.
Use that instead of the China stuff. I'm starting to think. I'm wondering if that Chinese pollen is actually pollen.
Yeah.
It doesn't look like pollen. Well, it looks like pollen, but it doesn't.
Depends on which bag you open.
Yeah, I'm. China.
Yeah, I know.
With their quality, you just gotta trust that they're giving you the actual.
Yeah, well, I just keep thinking it's irradiated, then, maybe it's, but who knows?
Yeah.
So he will sell it, and does he irradiate it, or
Yeah, there's a
He does.
place,
Nichols does?
in Pinawa that
Yeah.
does irrigation. Yeah,
That's a test, like Canadian nuclear.
yeah,
They
that's
do
where
it.
they do it, I think,
Yeah.
eh.
I thought.
But it's an easy way to spread disease if you don't
Yeah.
irradiate your pollen, because, I mean, all the living stuff's on the bees and everywhere, so you gotta make sure all that's dead. A lot of guys, most commercial guys, have moved away from pollen just because of the expense, but also the fear of contaminants. Farmers like to spray their fields, like we're spraying our canola fields with fungicide, so they're bringing in all this pollen off the fields that has fungicide on the pollen. And even though it's irradiated, it still has that residue of, and whether that fungicide is affecting the bees in an indirect way, we're not sure, but we're suspecting the bees aren't as thrifty when they ingest this fungicide. So we're trying to switch away from a pollen-based food. Unless you can trap pollen early in the spring, like the maple pollen and some of those early fruit pollens which aren't exposed to pesticide, then you can get a real pure food product. So yeah, that's how you read your hive, is you look to see if the larvae is swimming. And I've also started to feed late summer, early fall. This time of year, we're building the winter nest, right? And this time of year, we want to develop a real good winter nest to be able to prolong the extended period of dearth, which we call winter. The two most important times in the bee calendar year is the spring turnover, this point of time here, and building the winter bees in the fall. And this here is your winter nest, okay? As you can see, the age of the bees is getting really old. The bees just kind of hang on all through winter until spring, until they start brood rearing. And to be able to keep that winter nest viable all through winter, the bees have to be healthy. They have to be well fed, well nourished. So right in this period of time, this is your brood line. This is your winter nest right here. As that queen slows down her laying. So, you know, August, September, ending in October, that's your brood nest. And she's developing this brood right at the time of the year where we're seeing dearth in most areas around here. The fields are done flowering, the ditches have all been mowed, everything's pretty much dying. So all they're doing is they're creating this brood nest pretty much on the resources within that nest already. So unless you're in a real good spot where you have a lot of good fall pollen coming in, we have to make sure that these bees are well fed. So this is the time of year I've started targeting with supplement too. Put a couple pounds on the hive and just jolt that nest with nutrients just to make sure those bees are healthy. Because what we're looking at, this is a forager bee and this is a nurse bee, winter bee. When the bees, before they graduate into processing bees, foraging bees, what they do is they mine out all the nutrients within their bodies and they pass it on to the next generation of brood, which is this, the good stuff, the fats and the proteins, right? And the winter nest, when the bees develop a winter nest, they're developing a shitload of bees that are full of proteins and fats, and what they're doing is they're holding that reserve all through winter. So they're going through winter full of fats, and the fats and the proteins are holding their life until you put them back outside about this time here. And as soon as they start rearing that next cycle of brood, they're passing on those fats and proteins to that developing brood nest. And as soon as they start doing that, it's like their time clock starts. They got 3 weeks left to live because they're just passed on all their life to the next round of brood. So you want a well-fed nest in the fall to be able to get them to this point, to be able to turn over that winter nest into the springtime nest, right? So this is a very critical time of the year, and that's why you need well-fed bees. So you're tipping your colonies back in the fall. These are some of Carrie's nukes she's made up. And you want an adequate nest going into winter. That's our goal. So the last thing I'll touch on is feeding syrup. And carbohydrates really important for the bees. Sugars, that's what they need. And two strategies, springtime strategy and the fall time strategy. Two totally different feeding strategies for our bees. So in the spring, our goal is to fill in, same with protein. You have those dearths of proteins. Same with the nectar flows coming in. You have all those lulls, all those dearths. And by feeding sugar to them, we kind of fill in all those dips. And we don't want to bulk feed them. We want to kind of just sustain that growth, just to keep them going, to keep them alive. So we just kind of feed them hand to mouth. So you just kind of flash the syrup at them at this time of year. If you feed too much to them, they'll plug out and then they won't have any room to rear a brood, and that doesn't help anybody, and syrup's expensive. So we're just feeding syrup in the spring just to keep that colony moving forward. We don't want to store the syrup. In the fall, it's a different strategy. In the fall, we're feeding the nest to bulk them up for winter. We've taken all the honey, we give them back the sugar, and we're trying to bulk that nest up. Right at this period of time, when she's laying her winter nest, her laying goes down to where she's pretty much not laying at all into November. And when you take these boxes off, as she's decreasing your laying, what we do is all that empty space we now just backfill with syrup. So that's what we're doing. We're bulking that nest up. We're filling that box right up with syrup to firm it over winter on.
So is there any way to manipulate it to that, see, on your last slide, go back one where it dips in April, is there any way that, have you ever experimented with that to lessen that dip by feeding in March, let's say, or turning up your heat in the way you store them, things like that? Is it?
Yeah, well, that's a really good question. This is a real critical time in a bee's life cycle because they're switching from the winter strategy. They're rejuvenating the nest into the springtime growth, and when they're passing on all their nutrients into that brood and they're trying to rear that brood before they die is a real tough balance. Whether or not, see, my strategy is you put bees into winter, and the only thing I think about is just getting them to spring. I don't worry about stimulating through the winter. I don't worry about anything else, but just get those live bees to the point of spring. If you do it a little bit too early, and let's see, your bees are outside probably, right?
Ours are in a little shed.
Well, they are inside. Some guys will stimulate their hives earlier spring outside, trying to get a jump on spring, right? Which is fine, as long as they can make that turnover. But if all of a sudden, let's say they're trying to do it back here in March, if all of a sudden there's like, they have 4 frames of brood going on in there because they're giving them the resources to do it, and we get some miserable weather, that puts a huge strain on resources, and they gotta make sure they got everything they need in there, otherwise they're just gonna completely fall apart and die, right?
So that's what we're wondering, based on the inside temperature being at about 4 degrees, is there a way of manipulating that dip, and instead of having such a sharp, drastic dip, is to kind of ease them into spring by starting to build a hive up? Maybe bump the temperature up 2 degrees just to make it a little easier on them, put the sugar to them now, just in spurts, to see if that stimulates that hive to get going.
Yeah.
Instead of doing the big roaring start, to kind of just ease them into that.
I've always argued that the bees inside won't start laying until they see sunshine. We've always taken the bees out and there's no brood in those hives, except for last spring we take them out and they've already had a frame of brood going on in there. So they had to have started inside the shed. So I'm not exactly sure what the mechanisms are for the bees, when to start that whole process.
Well, that was my next question, what your experience was. That way we had all of our bees were exactly the same. They hadn't started except for one hive. They had just about filled the box already.
Yeah, and it really puzzles me. I don't know what these mechanisms are, whether or not it's their sensing.
I don't know if that was the one by the door, maybe, and it was getting
I don't know. I know there's one guy that's experimenting with In a shed setting, he was giving his bees a high protein feed just to try to jolt the nest, jolt the queen to start early brood rearing inside, kind of like you're talking about getting a jump start on spring and put them out and they're already going. But he did that, and it was a complete failure because he ended up having to keep his bees in just a little bit longer, and now he's fed all this protein to the bees. Their guts are full, and they fell right apart because Zima took over on them, or whether it's Zima or dysentery, I'm not sure, but.
And I think if you start feeding or bumping it up earlier, you're just going to move the timetable off of that, right? Like your winter bees express different genes than your summer bees, right? So when you start feeding, doesn't matter if it's February or March, like that dip is always going to happen. It's just a matter of where it's going to happen.
Yeah, I like to put my bees out. And it's the big guess, are we putting our bees out? In the spring going to start now? Or is it we're going to put them out and then get some more snow and miserable weather? So you put them out, get them going, and then have all this foul weather, and then they just kind of effectively, and you get spring dwindling because they can't fulfill that whole transition, so I like, and there's guys in, out in Quebec who winter bees inside sheds with air, like refrigeration, and they won't put their bees out until there's actual pollen coming out off the trees, because their strategy is that you're going to put your bees out, put them onto pollen, and then they're prolonging their hive as long as they can, and then they put them out into pollen. They know for sure it's a guarantee on off to the races. It's just, we put them out a little early sometimes, and they might struggle a little bit more than maybe they should,
Yeah, because our springs, they can be volatile that
It
way.
can be
and
very
they
volatile.
Move your bees in and out and in and out and try to play the weather a bit.
So that's why we want to keep our bees as healthy as we possibly can, like keep the mites off them. Keep the mites off them, there's going to be less virus in these bees. No Zima, we can't do anything about no Zima, but it's affecting that same turnover. If these bees can't live long enough to change, for those other bees to hatch, like new bees to hatch out, as the no Zima's shortening their life, right? They can't make an effective turnover, then you're going to have a colony dwindle on you, collapse on you. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things involved. So the last thing I'll touch on is feeder types. I know a lot of people who open feed, and we integrate open feeding into our feeding strategy. Primarily we use pail feeders. Do you guys use pail feeders or frame feeders, or what do you guys use in here?
Do you find any issues with those? I use pail feeders, but do you find any issues with those plugs? Do they leak?
No, we haven't so much. I know some of the guys, they'll put the pails and put them down too hard and the plug will pop out on it. But for the most part, they hold the suction pretty well. Yeah.
So do you find with that, though, especially in springtime when you have different temperatures, right, that it contracts and
Yeah.
and then it, sometimes it's not leaking and then it does because there's the temperature contracts them, but.
That's why we bought 1 gallon pails, is for
okay.
that exact reason. We have that great big 2.5 gallon pail.
Yeah, that's what I got, yeah.
And we can't stop the leaking.
Yeah.
So it all goes in the ground and we're feeding
Yeah.
ants all year.
Yeah.
And syrup's expensive. And in the
So
spring, we're
1
generally just giving them little flashes of syrup all the time. So we bought these little pails just to help for that very problem.
Okay.
And the suction can hold better in a smaller pail.
When you say flashes, you give them a full gallon at a time?
No, we're typically only filling them up half.
Okay.
We're just, I just send the guys to just keep them going and just half a pail, half a pail, half a pail. If they get really hungry, we'll fill a full pail up. If we see some bad weather and they need the feed, we'll give them a full gallon. But for the most part, it's kind of annoying. The guys, you say, well, we're going to be coming around next week anyways.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I
hey, we
think,
do it with mason jars.
Yeah, I've done the half-gallon mason jars. They seem to work.
So my theory is you just keep flashing it at them. It's kind of almost like a continuous nectar flow where you give them a big jolt of syrup and they'll store it. And I don't want them to store it. I want them to make brood out of this feed coming in. Right? So if you have neighbors close by, use something like that so you don't feed your neighbors. Keep their bees out of your apiary. If you don't have neighbors close by, we use open feeders, and this is a very effective way of feeding your bees. What we do is we just have these little totes, and we fill it up with syrup, and we put wood floats and some straw around the outsides. The bees come in, forage, and you bring it back to the colony. What you want to do is you want to create lots of surface area. So this is a yard of 40. There's a rule of one of these totes per every 10 hives. So if you have 4 totes in a yard of 40, that's enough surface area that there isn't a lot of bees fighting. And if you only have 1 tote in this yard of 40, you're going to have a lot of drowning. You're still going to see a big layer of drowned bees at the bottom. And the reason you see that is because the bees come in and they're crowding and they start drowning, and they drown like anything else drowning. They grab the guy above them and pull him down too, right? So if you don't have the fighting, you don't have the drowning. And very effective. I know some guys that don't own pails. They're in isolated areas and they do primarily open feeding.
How big is that tote we're looking at there?
That's a 90 liter. I had a 120 liter tote, and it's too much. You fill it right up because it just walls out and they crack.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I bought this slightly smaller ones, and they seem to hold up a lot better.
Okay. And you put just strips of wood in there?
Yeah, just some strips of wood and then a little bit of straw. Not too much straw, just enough to keep them from dropping.
Something to stand on.
Something just to grab onto, yeah.
Okay.
But the surface area is the important part there. Make sure they have lots of room when they're foraging on that. Yeah, and then these pails, they're just a screen, and we invert the pail over top of the hole. As the syrup pours out, it creates a vacuum on top there, and the bees just have a self-serve buffet there.
Do you ever use frame feeders?
I used to, but they're a lot of work, and a lot of guys in California who move their bees around like frame feeders because the feeder's always there. But they're in 2 boxes, and I manage 1 box, and I need all 10 frames. So it's a lot of work taking a frame out, putting a frame feeder in,
Yeah.
and then switching it back out through the winter. But frame feeders work really well, except if you have a really wet spring, you have the syrup inside that hive, and it'll increase the humidity inside that hive. So you might run into humidity problems inside the hive with open syrup inside like that. Otherwise, it's very effective. We use it in our queen building hives because it helps with the humidity. And we like to have the bees, give them lots of access to the syrup inside them. So that's everything I have to say, and I appreciate your time. And I hope to see most of you at the Manitoba Beekeeping Convention. There's a workshop on Saturday that I'll be speaking at. And anyways,